Hate wears a quiet face in towns like Brookhaven Ridge, hidden behind trimmed hedges and polite smiles. When a noose appeared on Elijah Grant's porch, the men who left it assumed he'd take the hint and leave like others before him. To them, he was just another soft-spoken black man with no fight in him. What they didn't know was Elijah once built the very systems used to track threats. And now he saw them clearly. They crossed a line thinking he wouldn't push back, but they didn't know he was trained for war, and this time it was personal. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The hum of sprinklers and the distant whir of lawn mowers filled the early morning stillness of Brookhaven Ridge. From a distance, it looked like a promise. Neatly trimmed hedges, American flags fluttering from porches, and pastel front doors all framed in flowering shrubs. The sidewalks curved just so. The neighbors smiled just enough. It was the kind of place real estate agents described as safe, clean, quiet. But Elijah Grant had learned that quiet didn't always mean peace. Sometimes it meant pressure, hidden, constant, and coded in politeness. He sipped his coffee from the kitchen window, watching a neighbor across the street fold a stars and stripes back into its holster. Another man walked by with his dog, nodding at Elijah without warmth. Just a flicker of acknowledgement. Elijah nodded back. No words, no need. It had been 5 months since he and Tanya moved here with their daughter Naomi. 5 months since they traded the tight corners of city life for open skies, better schools, and what the realtor called community spirit. At first, the silence had been welcome. But then came the glances. Then the flyer about neighborhood expectations slipped into their mailbox, unsigned, full of bolded words about yard appearance and noise control. Then it was the spray-painted garage down the block. Then it was the dog feces smeared across the windshield of a black couple's SUV. Then it was nothing. Nothing from the sheriff. Nothing from the HOA. Nothing but silence. Elijah had seen this before. Different town, different name, same pattern. And in patterns, he found purpose. He had spent most of his career building digital frameworks, tracking anomalies in secure networks, mapping threat behaviors. He wasn't the kind of man who responded loudly. He responded thoroughly. The past few weeks, he'd started keeping a spreadsheet. Harassment incidents, locations, dates. He began reviewing archived doorbell footage posted online by neighbors. One video showed a man in a black hoodie lingering too long outside a home. Another caught a slur scrawled across a fence, removed by morning. Most people missed the connections. Elijah didn't. He noticed the trucks, older models with blacked-out plates. He recognized the recurring symbol, an iron crow scratched into mailbox posts or spray-painted beneath outdoor lighting. It was fast, subtle, territorial, like a gang mark. Elijah searched local forums, found vague mentions of a militia years ago that had cleaned up nearby neighborhoods. No one named names. No one wanted to. Last week, a new couple had moved into a house 2 blocks over. Black, young, hopeful. Elijah saw the moving van from his driveway, watched them wave to neighbors who didn't wave back. That same night, their welcome mat was burned on their porch. When Tanya asked if they should bring over cookies, Elijah just said, "Not yet." He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. Tanya saw it too. She felt it in the way conversations with neighbors ended too quickly. The way Naomi's teacher hesitated when talking about her art. Something lived under the surface here, and it wasn't subtle. But Elijah kept his face calm, his voice even. At dinner, he asked about school. At work, he made no mention of anything unusual. But each night, after Naomi went to bed, and Tanya curled up with her book, Elijah returned to his screen, watching, cataloging, mapping. A week passed with no new incidents. He began to wonder if the pattern had gone dormant, if his presence was enough of a deterrent. Then came that morning. It was a Tuesday. Blue skies, birds, the usual rhythm. Elijah stepped outside to get the paper. As he rounded the porch post, he froze. There, tied tightly around the center column, was a noose. Not just rope, not string. A full, looped, thick-knotted noose. Stiff from weatherproofing, coarse like it had been made for show more than strength. His hand tightened around the rolled newspaper. No one was outside. No cars passed. The world moved forward as if nothing had happened. But this wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. Elijah didn't say a word. He stepped back inside, closed the door with care, and locked it. Then he walked quietly to the study, powered up his private terminal, and opened the file labeled Iron Crow Activity, Local. This wasn't a guess anymore. This was personal. And tonight, the real watching would begin. The first thing he did was double-check the angles. Every camera on the property had been repositioned and upgraded. One disguised in the mailbox, another embedded in the hedges beneath the motion lights, a third fitted into a porch column with a fisheye lens that offered a broad sweep of the yard. The fourth, his most critical, was mounted on the back eave, where it faced the alleyway that cut behind the homes like a forgotten service trail. It was there that they had come before, and it was there he expected them again. The footage ran constantly now, streamed through an offline server Elijah kept isolated from everything else. Each feed was clean, precise, time-stamped, and tagged by quadrant, with storage redundancies backing up to encrypted external drives. His eyes, sharp from years of work in cybersecurity and military-grade surveillance mapping, never drifted from the frames for long. At night, after Naomi fell asleep, and Tanya closed her book and reached to switch off the lamp, Elijah returned to his study like it was a second shift he had trained for all his life. And, in some ways, it was. For several nights, the recordings showed nothing more than the ordinary. Possums wandering across the yard, a neighbor's cat stalking a cricket near the porch, the faint shimmer of wind through the branches. But then came a movement too deliberate to be dismissed. The hedges trembled. A shadow appeared where there should have been none. 3 figures moved with careful, almost practiced ease across the yard, each one dressed in black hooded sweatshirts, with gloves that left no prints, no skin, no trace. They didn't linger or break stride. One walked straight to the garage and began spraying thick red letters across the panel, each stroke wide and angry, dripping even as the next line was drawn. 2 others moved to the driveway, each armed with blades they didn't hesitate to use. Elijah watched in silence as the tires on both cars were slashed clean through. Every one. 8 total. The camera caught the sharp sound of rubber tearing under pressure. The brief, low laugh one of them made before flicking his blade clean and tucking it back into his waistband. And then, like they had never been there, they slipped away, vanishing down the same alley that had always welcomed them. By morning, the message across the garage door had dried into a jagged warning. Move or burn. And the 2 cars sat crippled in the driveway, their tires shredded, sagging against the concrete like wounded animals left in the open. Elijah stood before it with a slow, steady gaze. He didn't call out to Tanya. He didn't touch the paint or reach for a hose. Instead, he lifted his phone, angled the lens, and began taking photos, wide frames, close-ups, shots that captured not just the words, but the shadows behind them, the stillness of the house, the untouched porch light above. He walked the length of the property and found what he had suspected the moment he'd switched from camera 3 to 4. The curled, lifeless body of a cat placed at the base of the tree in the front yard. Its neck was broken clean, Its fur was matted. There was no blood, no mess, just a perfectly intact body that had clearly been meant as a final signature. He gathered it in gloves, wrapped it carefully in a tarp, and placed it in the far bin behind the shed, out of view, out of reach, and far from where Naomi would ever come near. Returning to the study, he compiled the photos, adjusted contrast and clarity, stripped metadata for protection, and sent the entire packet to 3 separate recipients. The first was the sheriff's tip portal, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. The second was a local blog that often featured anonymous contributions. The third, a legal defense organization specializing in hate crimes. He didn't attach a message or request. The images alone carried enough weight. There was no response. Nothing changed. Not a patrol, not a follow-up, not even an inquiry. He waited, watching the feeds again that night, expecting, perhaps foolishly, that action might follow. But the inbox stayed silent. The footage, though damning, was ignored. And the voices of those who should have cared never arrived. The next time he saw Tanya in the driveway, she stood with her arms crossed, looking at the words on the garage, her silence sharper than anything she could have said. He stepped outside, meeting her where she stood, but she didn't turn to him right away. "You left it up," she said. Not quite a question, not quite a complaint. "I needed it seen." She nodded faintly, then lowered her gaze to the tires. "You really think this is going to make them stop?" "No," he said without hesitation. "But I think it's going to make them known." She looked at him now, her face filled with something closer to worry than anger. "And if being known doesn't scare them? Then they've already shown us where they stand." She stepped closer, lowering her voice so it wouldn't carry past the driveway. "I know what you're doing, Elijah. And I'm not saying you're wrong, but I need you to remember that Naomi lives here too." "I do remember," he said, voice even. "That's why I'm not cleaning it off." She didn't argue. She just walked back inside, quiet and slow. Later, Sheriff Langley appeared in a short clip on the local news feed after a brief inquiry about ongoing vandalism rumors. He leaned casually at a podium, badge polished, smile neutral. "We've received a few submissions," he said with a calm, practiced tone, "but so far, nothing we've seen gives us enough to act. The footage that's been circulated is inconclusive. It's hard to determine who's involved, or even what the intent was. We'll continue to monitor, of course, but as of now, there's no immediate cause for concern." Elijah watched it once, then twice, each time letting the words roll through him like smoke. Inconclusive. Intent unclear. No cause for concern. It was the same careful script used after a family's flag was burned last fall. The same words repeated after a black business was vandalized just outside town lines. The same shrug, dressed in uniform. He returned to his files and opened the folder marked Vehicles Suspected. A plate number matched a truck seen circling 3 nights ago. An older red Ford with one headlight dimmed. Enhancing the image, Elijah noticed a tattoo on the driver's forearm, visible just below the sleeve. A crow, wings spread, claws down. He traced the registration manually through a secured route and confirmed the name, Jason Cutter, Millstone Hollow. From there, the pattern unfolded. The truck's route appeared on 4 other feeds. 2 near the gas station, 1 at the closed-down hunting supply store, and another parked behind the fire station at night. He pulled up the traffic camera snapshots, overlaid the paths, and began constructing a route map, logging times, license plates, and frequency. And then he created a new entry. Subject: Cutter, Jason. Watch list: active. Because this wasn't just about who showed up on his lawn. It was about how far they were willing to go before someone stopped them. And Elijah wasn't waiting for permission. He spent the next week trailing patterns the way most men traced conversation. Before work and after dark, he drove without music, his phone face down on the passenger seat, eyes always shifting between rear-view mirrors and the road ahead. He kept a mental tally of the landmarks: the rusted gate near the power substation, the turnoff before the abandoned horse stables, the rutted path that looked like nothing more than overgrown pasture. That was where he first saw the gathering. It wasn't marked, no signs, no lights. Just a faint dirt road that bled into the edge of the forest, easily mistaken for a fire break or an old trail from when the town was smaller and the woods hadn't yet been carved into parcels. But the tire tracks told a different story. Elijah didn't follow on foot. He knew better than to risk exposure without understanding the layout, but from a distance, perched on a ridge just beyond the fence line, he could see the soft flicker of lanterns against a small wood structure nestled between trees. The cabin was no more than one level, the kind of place used for seasonal hunting or county retreats, but the number of vehicles parked outside told him it wasn't just weekend recreation. He zoomed in with a long-range lens mounted on a modified dash cam, catching clear frames of license plates. Two he already knew. One belonged to Jason Cutter. The other, previously tagged in his files, was linked to a man named Devin Ross, an employee of the city's Public Works Department. But it was the third that made Elijah lean forward in his seat. The black SUV belonged to a man named Harold Greer. Greer wasn't just a landowner, he was a member of the Brookhaven Ridge Town Council and had donated visibly to local law enforcement initiatives. Elijah had seen his name on campaign signs during the last election cycle, smiling with his hand on Sheriff Langley's shoulder in a photo that hung inside the courthouse lobby. That cabin was Greer's property, and now it served as the gang's regular gathering point. Elijah began logging every appearance: dates, times, weather, which vehicles stayed, which ones rotated. He noted when certain trucks arrived early, when they left late, and how sometimes they lingered past midnight, their engines off, their silhouettes standing in the open near firelight. No flags, no emblems, just conversations too far away to hear, and body language too sharp to ignore. Meanwhile, Naomi began drawing again. It had started quietly, with a pad and pencil set left on the kitchen table beside a glass of apple juice. Tanya encouraged it. She said it helped their daughter process the atmosphere. Less an activity, and more a mirror. Elijah hadn't thought much of it until he passed her room one afternoon and caught sight of a page that made him stop. It was a house, carefully drawn, with more detail than a girl her age usually bothered to capture. The driveway was shaded. The porch had a small planter beside the steps. But what caught his eye wasn't the house. It was the figures around it. 4 of them, drawn in black, with red slashes across their torsos. Each figure stood at a different point. One behind the garage, one near the alley fence, one in the yard, one beside a mailbox. None of them had faces. "Did you see this somewhere?" Elijah asked gently as he stepped into the room. Naomi looked up, chewing the end of her pencil. "I see them sometimes," she said. "They wait." He didn't ask more. He didn't want to lead her or put fear in her words. He just nodded, and when she left to wash up before dinner, he took a photo of the drawing and uploaded it into his encrypted archive. He labeled it Naomi Observation 1, Unfiltered. There were other sketches, too. Some showed pickup trucks without plates, drawn with rough shading and thick tires. One showed a tree, possibly the one near the front yard, with something beneath it that resembled a curled shape, a dark patch, a smear of color. He didn't ask her to explain. He just documented it. Back in the study, Elijah built a new chart that connected Greer to Ross, Ross to Cutter, and Cutter to the others. The names formed a lattice that wasn't hierarchical but circular, reinforcing each other, like an ecosystem designed to shield itself. That explained the sheriff's silence. That explained the sudden disappearances of evidence from prior cases, the unfiled complaints from other families who had once lived on this street and quietly disappeared overnight. Tanya noticed the shift in his focus, not just in the study, but in the way he moved through the house. Quiet, but always listening, always cataloging. One evening, as he washed dishes and watched the driveway through the kitchen window, she stood beside him and dried a glass without speaking. Then, gently, she said, "I saw your notes." He didn't stop scrubbing. "Which ones?" "The Greer connection." He nodded. "They're protecting them. Greer owns the land." Langley's ignoring the reports. Public Works employees are attending these meetings. They're building something off-record. Tanya set the glass down. "And how far are you planning to go?" Elijah turned off the water and faced her fully for the first time that evening. "As far as I have to. I'm not trying to fight them. I'm trying to expose them. But I have to get everything. Once. Clean. No room for denial." Her silence wasn't disagreement. It was concern. She knew he had crossed a line. Not legally, not morally, but internally. He was no longer reacting. He was hunting. And he wouldn't stop until the net was full. That night, long after the lights went out and the house settled, Elijah sat in the glow of the monitor, watching as 3 vehicles pulled into the wooded cabin once again. He watched as the men stepped out, greeted one another with firm nods, and disappeared into the door. He labeled the folder. Meeting 6, full rotation. He didn't know what was said inside that cabin. Not yet, but the walls were closing, and the story they were trying to keep quiet had already begun to echo through the dark. The morning began like any other, still and silent, the kind of calm that Elijah had learned not to trust. The sun was rising slow, casting long amber streaks across the dewy grass as he stepped outside to check the mailbox. Naomi had already left for school with Tanya, and the neighborhood, as usual, looked undisturbed. Driveways still damp, sprinklers ticking in rhythm, not a single curtain stirring behind the windows. He opened the metal flap, expecting bills, circulars, maybe the occasional insurance offer he never read. Instead, resting precisely in the center of the otherwise empty box, was a small padded envelope with no return address, no stamps, and no markings. The only thing written on it was his name. No title, no handwriting flourish, just block letters spaced evenly, heavy and intentional. He turned it over in his hands, noting the weight and the clean seal, and immediately understood this had not arrived through any official channel. It had been placed there directly, quietly, and close. He didn't hesitate. He tucked it beneath his arm and returned inside, locking the door behind him without a glance over his shoulder. He didn't plug the flash drive into his main setup. Instead, he inserted it into the isolated system that never touched the internet. A rig designed for this exact kind of uncertainty. Clean, hardened, immune to remote access. The drive clicked once. Then a folder opened automatically, containing 6 images. There were no file names, no folders, no metadata visible, just the images laid out bare. The first showed him kneeling beside the hedges, adjusting one of the camera mounts. The next was taken from across the street, angled through the driver's side window of a vehicle, catching his profile as he stepped out with a trash bag. Another had him standing at the edge of the driveway, arms folded, watching the end of the block. 2 more captured moments that could only have been seen from elevated windows. One of him at his desk inside the study, backlit by the monitor's glow, the blinds behind him slightly parted. Another taken while he stood in the kitchen, speaking to Tanya, her expression unreadable in the background. And the final image, perhaps the most disturbing, was of him seated on the porch just 2 nights prior, Naomi's sketchbook resting beside him, his face half in shadow, looking out into the street like he already knew someone was there. He stared at the images without blinking, feeling neither fear nor surprise, but something deeper, something colder. The recognition that the observation had become mutual. He had been documenting them. But now they had begun documenting him. He destroyed the drive methodically. The plastic casing snapped in half with a quick twist, the exposed connector crushed beneath the edge of his workbench vise. He wrapped the pieces in aluminum, sealed them in plastic, and disposed of them across 2 separate bins. Then he cleaned the workspace with a cloth dampened in alcohol, disinfecting every surface, wiping the keys, wiping the screen, wiping the weight of what he now knew. They weren't just watching. They wanted him to know they were watching. That afternoon, he adjusted the system again, not just for coverage, but for layered defense. A second set of sensors was mounted beneath the porch awning, calibrated to register body heat in close proximity. Another small lens was embedded inside the mailbox post, rigged to stream to a hidden server the moment the hatch was opened. He replaced the standard porch light with a modified dual-lens camera equipped with facial recognition software and infrared. A pair of dummy cameras was installed facing opposite directions, blatant distractions. The real surveillance happened from a weatherproof drone dock hidden beneath the gutter, charged and ready to deploy if triggered by unexpected motion within a 60-foot range. And from the top shelf of the closet, buried behind 2 folded moving blankets, he brought down the hard case he hadn't opened in over 6 years. Inside was a matte black pistol, oiled and perfectly preserved, along with 2 sealed magazines. He laid the weapon out on the workbench, disassembled it with practiced ease, cleaned it, reassembled it, and placed it back in the drawer beneath the desk, not out of panic, not out of rage, but because preparation was no longer optional. Later that evening, as Tanya cleared plates from the dinner table and placed them carefully into the sink, Elijah leaned against the doorway, watching her with a stillness that was no longer casual. "You've been quieter lately," she said, not turning around. "Even more than usual." "There's a reason," he said, "but I'm not ready to explain it until I have the whole picture." She looked over her shoulder then, her hands wet, her brow slightly furrowed. "Is it the cabin? Or the councilman?" "It's something else," he replied, stepping into the kitchen, lowering his voice as he reached for a towel. "Something closer." She dried her hands slowly, then faced him fully, her expression softening into something more intimate. "You don't have to protect me from knowing. You just have to trust that I can handle it." He nodded, his eyes not leaving hers. "I'm not trying to keep you in the dark. I'm just trying to keep you safe from what's in it." She reached up, touched the side of his face, then rested her hand on his chest. "Whatever this is, just don't let it pull you out of this house before you're ready. You don't owe them the first move. Let them show you what they want, and let them regret it." A long silence followed, filled only by the hum of the refrigerator and the soft clatter of Naomi's pencils upstairs. Then the burner phone rang. He turned toward the sound without speaking. She watched him cross the room, pick it up, and answer. No one spoke on the other end. There was no static, no click, no background noise, only a long, precise silence. The kind that wasn't accidental. The kind that waited. Elijah didn't speak either. He let the silence stretch, holding the line like it was a trap slowly tightening around itself. Then the call disconnected. He checked the log. No number, no trace. He looked at Tanya. She was already reaching for the towel again, drying her hands without breaking her gaze. "Is it starting?" she asked. "It already started," he said. "But now they want me to know I'm not the only one who's watching." "Then they've made their mistake," she said softly. "Because they think watching is the same as being ready." Elijah didn't reply. He returned to the study, opened the folder marked Cutter, Jock Greer, and added a new entry beneath the lattice of names. Unknown contact. Source, proximity. Method, psychological. Status, elevated. And beneath that, another. Next move, watch the watcher. The screen dimmed slightly as the room settled again, but Elijah remained still, the reflection of code flickering across his eyes. Outside, the neighborhood curled into its usual quiet, pretending peace where no peace remained. It started with a name that Elijah hadn't expected to surface, one tucked between mentions in an archived newspaper article he'd stumbled across while cross-referencing past vandalism cases. The piece, faded and poorly scanned, detailed a protest in front of the Brookhaven County Courthouse nearly 15 years ago. At the center of the photo stood a man with a calm expression and a steady gaze, holding a sign that read, "We were never meant to stay quiet." Beneath the photo, the caption named him Darnell Price. The name stayed with Elijah as he drove downtown that afternoon, not on a lead, but on instinct. He parked near the edge of Ashland Park, a quiet green stretch bordered by older homes that hadn't been touched by the recent wave of suburban remodeling. In one of those homes, tucked behind a fence with paint peeling at the corners, lived the man from the photo. Darnell opened the door with a cautious eye and a hand still resting on the frame. But once Elijah introduced himself and mentioned the cabin, the Iron Crow markings, and the silence from Sheriff Langley's office, the older man stepped aside and motioned him in without a word. The living room was small, lined with bookshelves that bowed under the weight of history. Civil rights memoirs, law journals, newspapers folded neatly into plastic sleeves. A wall near the back held framed photos, not of family, but of marches, vigils, and town meetings where Darnell had stood in front of men who called him trouble and still couldn't move him. "I've seen your face before," Darnell said, as he settled into a well-worn armchair, gesturing for Elijah to take the couch. "You the one in that newer place off Briarview, right? The porch, with the flowers your daughter tends to." Elijah nodded slowly, already aware that this man noticed more than most. "They left a noose on my porch," Elijah said plainly. "Then they came back. Painted threats, slashed tires, killed someone's cat, and left it in my yard." Darnell didn't react with surprise. His fingers steepled slowly as he listened, not interrupting. "I've tracked 4 of them so far. 2 work under Greer, one's in public works, one's connected to the sheriff's office through his nephew," Elijah continued, keeping his voice low and composed. "They're meeting at Greer's hunting cabin on county land. Nobody's saying a word." "They never do," Darnell said after a pause. "Not when it's theirs. Not when it's always been theirs. You know who they are?" "I know who they used to be," Darnell replied, his tone shifting. "Back when they called themselves the Riders, they used dogs and chains to push families out of Ridge Creek. When they became the Guardians, they said they were just concerned citizens, patrolling for looters after the 2008 crash. Then it was the Hollow Watch. Now it's Iron Crow. Same people, same fear, just new paint on an old shed. And they're being protected." Darnell's jaw tensed, his eyes darkening with a weariness that came from repetition. "Brookhaven protects its own, son. Always has. Doesn't matter what uniform they wear, police, council, neighbor, they close ranks when someone from the outside starts asking too many questions." "I'm not from the outside," Elijah said. "I live there. My wife teaches there. My daughter walks those streets." "And that's exactly why they'll try to push you harder than the rest," Darnell said. "Because staying means showing the rest of us how wrong they are, and nothing scares them more than proof." Elijah leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice calm but unshaking. "I'm not going anywhere, but I don't want to just hold ground. I want to make this visible, not just to them, to everyone." Darnell nodded once. Then make sure you know how deep it goes. Because once you pull back that curtain, there's no putting it down again. Meanwhile, across town, Tanya had begun noticing something that didn't feel accidental. Naomi had come home from school with questions, not the kind about math or art, but about why a group of girls refused to sit beside her at lunch, why one boy muttered something under his breath in the hallway and smiled when the teacher ignored it. Tanya had seen signs like this before. Small things, coded things. The school didn't call it bullying. They called it miscommunication, misunderstanding. But it was building. So she started talking to other parents quietly. A conversation in the grocery aisle, a check-in after pickup, a shared look outside the gym after another awkward PTA meeting. What she found was that their daughter wasn't alone. Other families had noticed the same pattern. Black children being separated, blamed, watched more closely, teachers brushing off questions, principals pivoting the conversation. The town had kept its hands clean, but the mess was still seeping beneath the surface. Tanya didn't call a meeting. She didn't make a speech. She started a private message thread. A handful of mothers, a few fathers, parents with eyes wide open and phones that had already captured screenshots, comments, emails. Together, they began documenting. Not publicly, not yet, but thoroughly. She called it the ledger. It was simple. Each post tagged with a date, a location, a name. Each entry cross-referenced with a school calendar, a district policy, and a question. Is this accidental? The answer was almost always no. Back in the study, Elijah compiled everything Darnell had told him into a new document titled Crow, Generational Patterns. He added the older names of the group, flagged the newspaper articles that corroborated Darnell's claims, and created a timeline that stretched across 2 decades. With it, he included a diagram, a spiderweb of surnames that repeated through police rosters, county tax boards, zoning commissions. What began as a local gang was something else entirely. A tradition disguised as vigilance, passed down like folklore between men who believed they were guardians of something sacred. But Elijah wasn't working alone anymore. Now, he had a name. He had a history. And Tanya was building something of her own. They weren't just holding the line. They were drawing a new one. It began with a sound Elijah couldn't quite name at first. A low thump, distant but sharp enough to pull him from his chair in the study. The night had been uneventful up to that point, quiet enough to make the sound all the more jarring, like something had broken through the stillness that usually blanketed the street after sundown. He paused, his finger hovering over the keyboard, eyes flicking toward the window as the silence that followed pressed in with sudden weight. Then came the second sound. Louder, closer. Not a car backfiring, not fireworks. Something heavier, something that carried heat. He stood quickly and crossed to the hallway, his steps silent, trained. The house remained dark behind him, the only light spilling from the monitor's edge as he stepped onto the porch and scanned the horizon. At first, there was nothing. No voices, no movement. But then, beyond the rooftops, he saw the faintest glow rising above the tree line. Orange, unnatural, not lightning, not the flicker of distant street lamps. Elijah moved fast. He grabbed his jacket, slid the small case from beneath the desk drawer, and tucked it beneath his shirt. In the driveway, he passed Tanya, who was standing at the front window, brows knit in concern. "What was that?" she asked, already knowing he wouldn't have an easy answer. "I don't know yet," he said, already climbing into the car. "But I'm going to find out." "Be careful," she said, her voice low but firm, not stopping him, just anchoring him. He pulled away from the curb without headlights, gliding quietly along the lane until he turned the corner and saw it. The flames were licking at the garage of a single-story house near the edge of the development. gray siding, modest porch, and a family he didn't know by name, but had seen more than once walking the dog at dusk. A black couple, maybe early 40s, and a son who rode his bike up and down the sidewalk each weekend. Now, the bike lay on its side near the front lawn, its wheels spinning slowly, caught in the backdraft of rising heat. The air crackled, smoke twisted upward, black and alive. Elijah parked 2 houses down, grabbed his phone, and moved fast but low, keeping to the tree line. The fire hadn't reached the interior yet, but the garage door was nearly gone, curled inward, the paint bubbling, glass from the side window blown out across the driveway like scattered ice. Across the scorched panel, barely visible between streaks of soot and smoke, was a familiar emblem. A crow, painted in thick black lines, wings extended, claws down, beak open. He snapped 3 photos quickly, then dropped to one knee and scanned the ground. Shards of glass. A broken bottle neck, still wet with the smell of gasoline. A scorched rag near the edge of the curb. There was no question what it was. Molotov. They had escalated. He moved toward the side yard, away from the rising heat, and paused by the fence. From his angle, he saw the back door of the house swing open. A woman stepped out with a phone in one hand, her other arm wrapped protectively around her son. Her voice was high, panicked, repeating the address to someone who clearly wasn't answering fast enough. Elijah wanted to approach, but he knew better. He stayed where he was, watching as the father came out behind them, dragging a half-filled bucket of water and coughing violently. The family was safe. Shaken, but out. Sirens finally began to rise in the distance, slow and reluctant, as though delayed by something Elijah couldn't name. He backed away from the fence line and returned to his car without drawing attention, watching as the first engine turned the corner just as the garage gave in with a deep groan, the roof caving inward in a hiss of sparks and smoke. Once home, he uploaded the photos. The crow matched the markings from his previous files. Same angles, same spacing between the wings. It wasn't rushed. It was a signature, intentional and practiced. Tanya was waiting in the kitchen, phone in hand, the glow of a news app still open on the screen. "It's already up," she said, turning the device toward him. "They're calling it a suspected electrical fire. No mention of arson, no mention of a symbol." "They'll bury it," Elijah replied, not angry, just sure. "Unless someone gives them a reason not to." He opened a new file. Tag, Incident, 17, Waverly. He time-stamped it, logged the emblem, the Molotov evidence, the photographs, and the delayed emergency response. He cross-checked nearby traffic cameras, pulled the frames manually, and paused when he saw a vehicle parked 2 blocks down, minutes before the first sound. A black pickup with a dented bumper and no visible plate. He enhanced the image and saved it under a new tag. Suspected watch vehicle. Event match. Upstairs, Naomi's lamp flicked off behind her closed door, the glow under the threshold disappearing into stillness. Tanya stood beside him, watching the footage repeat in the corner of the screen, her fingers tight around her mug. "They're not hiding anymore," she said quietly. "No," Elijah said. "They think no one will look close enough to matter." Her eyes didn't leave the image of the crow. "They're wrong," she whispered. Elijah didn't say anything more. He just reached for his notebook and started outlining the events. Everything he remembered. Everything the camera missed. Because fire, even when it fades, leaves a scar, and he wasn't about to let it vanish into paperwork. They had crossed another line. And this time, the burn wouldn't be theirs alone. The day after the fire, Elijah didn't sleep. He spent the early morning combing through every byte of metadata captured from the traffic cam files and private recordings, checking timestamps, license plate overlays, and the faintest signals of proximity triggers from his home surveillance grid. His focus was methodical, layered. What he couldn't see with the naked eye, he enhanced through filters. What he couldn't hear clearly, he ran through frequency isolators. And what he couldn't decipher alone, he sent across a secured channel to the one person he trusted outside his home. Marcus Wynn wasn't just a former colleague. He had been Elijah's partner in the field during contract years with a high-clearance cybersecurity firm, the kind that operated quietly behind federal projects and never printed business cards. While Elijah had stepped away from that life to build something closer to peace, Marcus had gone deeper, buried in back-end systems, private defense contracts, and encryption layers thick enough to choke a satellite. If there was anyone who could make sense of the fragments Elijah had collected, it was Marcus. Within hours, Marcus responded. "I decrypted the strings embedded in the server addresses you flagged," his message read. "There's an unusual redundancy. Someone's rerouting traffic through internal proxies, local proxies, military-grade formatting, but it's been doctored. And one string showed up 3 times. Elijah opened the attached capture. OP Anchor 01139. A reference, a code name, and not one he recognized from any civilian registry. He opened a live chat, activated voice masking, and waited. Marcus answered on the first ring. "I pulled the trigger logs," Marcus began without greeting. "Elijah, these people aren't just trading messages. They're using old network scripts lifted from the Civil Preparedness Systems Initiative, the one Homeland mothballed after the rollout failed." "That was supposed to be dissolved years ago," Elijah replied, his voice low, cold. "It was. But parts of it were adapted, reissued, and buried inside civilian partnerships with local governments. Nothing formal, nothing ever signed in ink. But Operation Anchor was one of those threads. It was designed as an internal safety net, community stabilization units in case of large-scale disruption, floods, blackouts, civil unrest, that kind of thing. And someone turned it into a militia. Marcus exhaled through the line. Not just that. They branded themselves as unofficial civil defense. Local officials protect them. Let them run surveillance under the radar, train on private land, use gear routed through dummy requisitions. It's the oldest trick in the book. And this group, the Iron Crow movement, they've been copied across 4 counties. Brookhaven's just the most organized. Elijah sat still, one hand resting on the edge of the desk. So, the sheriff knows. He has to. The initial access key used to build the digital entry point came from someone inside a public safety department. Could be police, could be emergency services, but someone local handed them the door. "Can you send me everything you pulled?" "I already did. Files are clean, stripped of tracebacks. But if you're thinking of making it public, know this. Once it's out, it can't be pulled back." "I'm counting on that," Elijah said quietly. By nightfall, Elijah had converted the decrypted data into a clean, accessible packet. No fluff, no speculation. Just facts. IP traces, code snapshots, screen caps of the decrypted communication threads, references to Operation Anchor, and affiliated support tags linked to defense frameworks no longer publicly acknowledged. The names of those involved were scrubbed for legality, but the pattern was undeniable. He didn't send it to law enforcement. He posted it to a private advocacy group known for whistleblower releases. Then another, focused on rural civil rights violations. And finally, a small journalist collective that tracked vigilante movements in American counties labeled low risk on the federal threat map. The file spread fast. Within an hour, forums began buzzing. Within 3, local social media feeds exploded. Comments poured beneath the data leak. Residents questioning how long this had been happening, why their taxes supported programs they'd never heard of, and why families like Elijah's were the ones being left unprotected. A hashtag began to circulate. An anchor unmasked. Photos of the Crow graffiti reappeared. No longer just tags, but warnings. The quiet network the gang had depended on was unraveling. By the next morning, Sheriff Langley stood stiffly at a podium outside the courthouse, flanked by his usual deputies, none of whom looked entirely comfortable. A row of local news microphones clustered in front of him, their foam covers bright in the late sunlight. He cleared his throat before beginning. "We are aware of a data dump circulating online that alleges connections between our office and a so-called local militia. I want to be absolutely clear. These claims are unfounded, misleading, and intended to provoke fear within our community." Elijah watched the feed from his laptop, expression unchanged, Tanya standing behind him, arms folded across her chest. Langley continued, his voice climbing slightly. "There is no Operation Anchor active in Brookhaven Ridge. There are no vigilante units sanctioned by this office. Any references to such programs are either fabricated or grossly misunderstood. We will continue to investigate the source of these false documents and take appropriate legal action if necessary." The reporter from the Ledger-Standard raised a hand. "Sheriff, can you confirm whether any of the individuals named in previous community complaints are tied to the hunting cabin owned by Councilman Greer?" Langley stiffened. "Councilman Greer's property is private. I'm not here to comment on personal activities conducted on private land. This press conference is about dispelling rumors, not validating them." Another reporter spoke up, louder this time. "So you're saying the graffiti, the burned vehicle, the family that almost lost their home last night? None of that is connected?" Langley's jaw flexed. "I'm saying we don't have enough verified information to draw those conclusions. We ask the public not to engage in speculation. That only escalates tension unnecessarily." Tanya turned off the stream. "He's drowning," she said. "Even if he doesn't know it yet." Elijah nodded once, slowly. They depended on silence. That was their cover. But the more they speak now, the more they leave tracks. He opened the new thread Tanya had added to her parent group. Entries had doubled. More families coming forward. More stories that matched. Each one another point of pressure, tightening around the same core names. The truth was no longer scattered. It had shape now. And it had weight. The leak spread farther than Elijah expected. It didn't just rattle local officials or trend briefly online, it broke containment entirely. By the third day, one of the major cable networks had picked up the story, their lead anchor summarizing the leaked files beneath a split-screen image of the charred garage and the Iron Crow symbol painted in black. It was no longer just Brookhaven's secret. It had become a national headline. Militia or civil defense. A small town's hidden network sparks outrage. The article was reprinted in 5 different cities within 24 hours. And that was when they came. Black SUVs with government plates rolled into the county without fanfare, parking in long lines outside the sheriff's office and municipal buildings. The doors opened fast. No lights, no sirens, just clean suits, flat expressions, and briefcases that never left their sides. The official line was that they were assisting with coordination and ensuring protocol integrity. But Elijah knew better. You don't send that many federal agents for damage control. You send them for containment. He watched from a distance the first time they walked into the courthouse, noting how Sheriff Langley's posture had changed. Not defensive, not nervous, but cooperative in a way that suggested long-standing familiarity. These weren't outsiders imposing authority. These were reinforcements. That night, Tanya returned home from the school board meeting with a strange look in her eyes. She told him that 2 agents had visited the superintendent earlier that day, asking vague questions about community sensitivity thresholds and student exposure to unrest. The terms were clinical, sanitized, but the meaning beneath them was chilling. "They're not just investigating," she said, folding her arms. "They're taking inventory." Elijah didn't respond. He was already reviewing footage from his front porch camera. One of the SUVs had idled outside his house for 17 minutes the night before, parked just far enough to be plausible but close enough to be deliberate. No one got out. No one approached. But the car remained there, lights off, engine humming quietly beneath the sound of wind and late-night insects. The next morning, two men in jackets marked with understated Homeland Security insignias approached his front door. They were polite, brief. They asked to speak to him about the leak and whether he could provide a more detailed timeline for when he'd first suspected the Iron Crow network was active. Elijah answered their questions calmly, offering nothing unnecessary. He watched their eyes as he spoke. One man maintained the professional neutrality expected of someone following a script. The other, slightly older, kept glancing toward the study through the front hallway, as if something inside stirred recognition. He asked fewer questions. But when Elijah handed him a printed list of license plates tied to the vehicles captured near the cabin, the man accepted it with a faint pause, just enough to register thought before slipping it into his folder. As they turned to leave, the older agent hesitated. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper, handing it to Elijah with the same mechanical movement one might use to offer a receipt. "This got caught in the folder," he said, his voice calm. "Didn't want it to fall out." Elijah nodded and took it. The agents walked away. Only once the SUV turned the corner did he unfold the paper. In neat block lettering, 3 words had been written in pencil. "We didn't expect you." He read it 3 times. The message was not a warning. It was an acknowledgement. That evening, he stood in the study longer than usual, not working, not cataloging, just staring at the grid of connections he'd mapped across his walls and screen. He had always assumed he understood the roles: villains, protectors, bystanders, but now something else crept into the outline. A gap. A question not about them, but about himself. Why wouldn't they expect him? He had been trained for this kind of surveillance, this kind of pattern recognition. Even his restraint, his patience in gathering evidence rather than striking first, was textbook. But whose textbook? In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath old military papers and sealed credentials, Elijah found a manila envelope he hadn't opened in years. Inside were remnants from a prior assignment, a clearance card from a private contract linked to federal resilience programs, an NDA stamped with symbols he had always glossed over, and a printed overview of a database system he once helped build. It wasn't called Operation Anchor then. It had a different name. But the infrastructure, the objectives, the talk of community integration protocols, they were all there. He stared at his own handwriting in the margins of one page, noting his initials beside a redacted list of behavioral flags, criteria used to monitor domestic disruptions in specific regions. That database had been years ago. Long before Brookhaven. Long before the move. He hadn't thought about it since he left that world. But someone had. And now, someone inside that SUV had recognized him, not because he was a nuisance, but because he had once built the tools they were still using. Tanya found him that night seated in the dark, the envelope open on the desk, the paper clutched loosely in one hand. "I thought you were reviewing the footage again," she said softly. "I was," he replied, his voice quieter than she'd heard in weeks. "But I think I've been watching the wrong screen." She came closer, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" He held up the slip of paper. "One of them left this." She read it. "We didn't expect you." They didn't mean here. They meant in the way, inside the wrong layer of the system. They didn't expect me to interfere, because they didn't expect me to remember. Remember what? Elijah looked up at her slowly, his expression unreadable, but there was a shift in his eyes, like something inside him had finally clicked into place, something he didn't want to admit, but couldn't ignore any longer. He held the slip of paper loosely in his hand, the message still echoing in his head as he spoke. "I helped build it," he said quietly. Tanya frowned. "Build what?" "The original frame. The system they're using now. I was part of it. Years ago. Back when it was just data modeling, neighborhood tracking, civil stability mapping. It wasn't supposed to turn into this." Her voice dropped. "You're saying you created the thing they're hiding behind?" "I didn't know it would be used like this," he said, almost to himself. "It was buried in pieces, split across departments. They said it was just theoretical. They told us it would never leave the sandbox." Tanya didn't move. She just stared at him, letting the weight of it settle. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable, not because she was angry, but because they both knew what it meant. This wasn't just about Brookhaven anymore. It was about something deeper, something Elijah had carried unknowingly into their lives. The air in the room felt heavier, like a door had opened to a past neither of them saw coming. Outside, the street looked the same. Quiet houses, soft light, nothing out of place. But the quiet didn't feel safe anymore. It felt staged. Elijah looked back at the desk, then at her. "They didn't expect me to interfere," he said. "Because they didn't expect me to remember." And now, the line they had been watching from a distance wasn't just circling them. It was cutting straight through. The days that followed stretched with a slow, deliberate tension. Elijah moved through them like a man walking deeper into fog, every step revealing more, every turn obscuring something he once thought he understood. Tanya stayed close, watching him, not questioning his silence, but anchoring it with her presence. And Naomi, unaware of the storm building around them, kept drawing. She always had a sketch pad nearby, sometimes on the living room couch, sometimes curled up in her room, with pencils fanned out beside her like sun rays. Lately, her drawings had taken on a strange precision. Elijah noticed it one evening when he walked past her door and saw her hunched over the page, completely absorbed. He paused and looked without interrupting. She had drawn another crow, this one perched on a mailbox that looked remarkably like theirs. But it wasn't the bird that caught his attention. It was what was underneath. 3 shapes, nested diamonds, interlocking lines in an angular formation. Elijah stepped in quietly. "Naomi," he said softly, "where did you see that?" She looked up, blinking as if she hadn't realized he was there. "It was on the wall by the alley, the one behind the yellow house. You can only see it when the sun hits it a certain way." He walked over and crouched beside her. "You're sure it looked like this?" She nodded, handing him the sketch pad. "I copied it. I thought maybe it was part of their symbol." He stared at the pattern for a long time. Something about it scratched at the edge of memory. Too clean to be random. Too structured to be graffiti. It wasn't until he returned to the study and pulled out an old hard drive from his Army intel days that it clicked. He hadn't thought about those codes in years. Back then, they were classified reference markers, tags used to track scenarios in simulated domestic threat models. They weren't meant to appear in the real world. They were for training, protocol development, internal reference. He remembered seeing them on internal memos, embedded in scenario files labeled Civic Cascade Simulations, back when his job was to build patterns into the architecture of public defense. He opened the drive and began searching, but half the folders were locked behind outdated permissions. Others had been overwritten or corrupted. Finally, he found one document buried in a shell directory, an operations summary for a contingency protocol. The title had been blacked out. So had the personnel list, but the visual watermark in the corner was still intact. 3 nested diamonds, exactly as Naomi had drawn them. Elijah leaned back, the chill rising through him not from the room, but from something deeper, a realization that wasn't sudden, but undeniable. This wasn't just about the Iron Crows adopting a convenient symbol. They were using embedded markers from a government classification system, one not meant for public eyes. And somehow, they had access to it. He tried pulling the metadata. Blocked. Tried routing through his backup authentication. Access denied. When he attempted to use the old clearance code Marcus had once shared, the screen flashed red. Request restricted. OP Anchor, Level 3. Elijah stared at the words as if they were a warning he could feel in his chest. He sat motionless for a long time, then shut the system down, removed the drive, and slid it back into its case. He pulled out his phone and dialed the only person who might know what these symbols were doing in Brookhaven. Darnell Price didn't answer. The first call went to voicemail. So did the second. By the third, Elijah left a message. I need to talk. It's about the symbols. You said they changed names. I think this goes further. Call me. No response came. The next day, he stopped by Darnell's house in Ashland Park. The porch light was off. Curtains drawn. The car parked across the street, usually Darnell's, was gone. A neighbor working in his yard gave Elijah a nod, but looked away too quickly when Elijah approached. He hasn't been around since yesterday, the man said. Said he was visiting family. Didn't say where. Elijah nodded, thanked him, and walked away. But something didn't sit right. Back at home, Naomi brought him another drawing. This one showed a wall of tangled symbols, not just crows, but variations of the diamonds, circles, and bars mixed in like static. Elijah didn't recognize all of them, but he saw enough to know they weren't just art. They were being used, left behind as signals, markers. Naomi tilted her head. Do they mean something? He looked at her and forced a soft smile. Yeah, they do. She watched him for a moment longer. Are you scared? His answer came slower than expected. No, just more aware now. She nodded like she understood, even if she didn't fully. That night, Elijah stood by the window, staring out at the still street, his arms crossed, eyes scanning the shadows like they might speak back. Tanya joined him without saying anything, slipping her hand into his. She didn't ask about the drawings or the file. She had seen enough to know that something had shifted again. This time not from the outside, but from deep within the story Elijah was piecing together. Darnell's silence wasn't just absence. It was avoidance. And the symbols Naomi had drawn were more than relics. They were part of something alive, something waiting to be recognized. The arrests started just days after the leak went viral. One by one, the names Elijah had been tracking for weeks began showing up in brief mentions on local forums and buried lines in the police log. Jason Cutter was the first. A neighbor posted that unmarked vehicles had pulled up outside his house early in the morning. No sirens, no shouting, just men in plain clothes with radios who entered the house, stayed for half an hour, and left with Cutter in the back seat of a dark SUV. No one saw him return. Then came Devin Ross, the city worker tied to the councilman's cabin property. Arrested during what was labeled a routine internal investigation. No details were given, only a vague line in the city's employee bulletin about administrative leave pending legal review. 2 more disappeared from Elijah's watch list. Vehicles gone, job titles scrubbed from city directories, homes quiet. The local paper ran a single paragraph. Several individuals are currently being investigated in connection with recent acts of community unrest. Officials are cooperating with federal partners to ensure public safety. No names, no mugshots, no charges listed. Just a neatly wrapped summary suggesting that consequences had arrived. At first glance, it looked like justice. The community, already stirred by the leak, began to settle. Some praised the authorities for acting swiftly. Others claimed the system had worked. Comments began popping up on local threads. Glad to see action finally taken. Brookhaven won't tolerate hate. We can breathe again. But Elijah didn't breathe. He watched. He read between the lines. Because what others saw as justice, he saw as maintenance. A carefully staged display meant to restore order, not truth. None of the arrested men had appeared in court. No public statements were made. No charges were formally presented. They had simply vanished, absorbed into a process too smooth, too quiet, and far too convenient. It didn't feel like prosecution. It felt like containment. Then Tanya came into the study, holding her phone. They posted it. She handed him the article. It wasn't on the front page of the Brookhaven City Watch, but tucked behind a school board announcement and a piece about summer road repairs. Sheriff Langley announces retirement, effective immediately. The article praised his decades of service, his commitment to law and order, his measured response during recent events. It mentioned nothing of the leaked files, nothing about the Iron Crow connections, nothing about the footage. Just the image of him smiling in his uniform at the last Founders' Day parade, hand over heart, flag waving behind him. He was stepping down with full pension. No hearing, no investigation, no questions. Elijah stared at the screen, jaw clenched. Tanya folded her arms. "They're tying it off like a loose thread," she said. The gang disappears, the sheriff bows out, and we're supposed to believe the story is over. Elijah stood, pushing back from the desk. "This isn't justice. It's choreography." Tanya's voice dropped. "So what now?" He didn't answer right away. He walked over to the window and looked out across the yard where it had all started, where the noose had once hung, where silence had tried to make itself king. The lawn was still, untouched. But he no longer saw a house surrounded. He saw a platform. "We take it public," he said finally. "You already did. The leak—" "No," he said, turning to her. "That was just information. I'm talking about people, presence. We do it where they can't ignore it, in the open. Right here." Tanya followed his gaze. "You want to bring them here? I want the whole town to see where it started. I want them to know the symbols, the silence, the history. And I want them to see that we didn't run from it. We named it, and we stood on it." She was quiet for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Then we'll need chairs, shade, something for the kids." He smiled faintly. The first real smile in days. "And speakers. And cameras. We'll document every word." That evening, Elijah sent out messages, not just to watchdog groups and media outlets, but to neighbors, churches, parents in Tanya's quiet coalition. People who had whispered in backyards, who had nodded in grocery aisles without saying too much. He told them it was time, not to fight, but to stand. Not to call it closure, but continuation. He drafted the flyer himself. No dramatic language, no confrontational tone, just one line at the top, where the line was drawn, and beneath it, an open community gathering. In truth, in light, in public, all are welcome. He pinned it to community boards, emailed it to lists that had been quietly growing, delivered printed copies to porches one by one. No politics, no blame, just presence, witness. The morning had started with momentum, a sense of movement that had been building ever since Elijah sent out the first wave of invitations. The flyers were circulating faster than he could track. More neighbors had begun to respond, some with cautious support, others with a quiet determination in their tone, the kind that didn't need applause to carry weight. The upcoming gathering, once just an idea born from frustration and truth, was taking shape as something larger than either of them had anticipated. Tanya was organizing food and folding chairs with a quiet urgency. Naomi, unaware of how close the storm had come, had started working on a bold poster board in the living room, her charcoal sketches taking form with the kind of focused energy that reminded Elijah of who this was all really for the ones too young to name what was happening, but old enough to feel it. That night, for the first time in weeks, Elijah allowed himself a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. He drifted off beside Tanya with a sense that, while the danger hadn't passed, the tide was shifting in their favor. That truth was gaining ground, and with it came a measure of hope, however temporary. But somewhere deep in the silence of that night, a sound reached him. At first it was subtle, almost indistinguishable from the usual creaks of the house settling against the cold. But this was different. Too sharp, too clean. The faint snap of glass, followed by the soft scuff of shoes against wood, filtered in from the direction of the study. It was enough. Elijah's eyes opened instantly, and he rose without hesitation, every part of him alert in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with instinct. He moved quickly and silently down the hallway, pausing only long enough to gesture for Tanya to stay in the bedroom. She said nothing, but her hand reached for the nightstand where she kept her phone. Elijah stepped into the hallway and made his way toward the study. As soon as he crossed the threshold, he felt the shift, the cold air moving through the broken window, the smell of tampered circuits, and the thick, heavy emptiness of a space that had been deliberately stripped. The desk was cleared. Not just disrupted, not rummaged through, but cleared with surgical precision. The external drives were gone. His archive logs, backup devices, flash keys, and personal systems, all removed. The monitor had been powered off, but left intact, the cables cut clean at the base. The sketchbook that Naomi had left tucked beside his desk, her recent drawings layered with the symbols he now believed to be far more than graffiti, was missing too. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing else in the house had been touched. The television was still on the wall. Their wallets and keys were still on the kitchen counter. The motive was unmistakable. This had been a retrieval. The lights hadn't triggered. The sensors hadn't tripped. The drone never launched. Not because the system failed, but because someone had known exactly how to move through it. The spacing, the dead zones, the calibration thresholds. They didn't break in. They bypassed it like a fingerprinted door, because the blueprint had once been his protocols, his logic, his blind spots, and now they'd been turned against him. As he moved from room to room, checking every point of entry, he found no signs of forced access except for the back window, which had been shattered in a way that suggested both speed and familiarity. The motion lights hadn't gone off. The alarm had been bypassed. Whoever had done this knew his system intimately, knew where the blind spots were, where the real data was stored, and what to leave behind to send a message. Tanya met him in the kitchen, her robe drawn tight, her face pale but steady. "I thought it was the wind," she said softly, her voice lined with guilt and tension. "I didn't hear anything after that. You stayed with Naomi," Elijah said, his tone even, his focus already sharpening again. That's all that mattered. He left her at the table and stepped into the garage, pulling open the access panel beneath the workbench and retrieving the tracker reader he hadn't used since before the leak. Something about the break-in felt too timed, too precise, and he needed to be sure. When he moved to the underside of the car and scanned the frame, the reader emitted a quiet ping. The signal was weak, masked by shielding, but there, magnetized to the rear axle, was a slim black device, military issue, coated in anti-reflection resin and nearly invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. He removed it carefully, wrapping it in copper mesh, and sealing it in a lead-lined container he kept for this exact kind of breach. No doubt remained now. This wasn't just local retaliation. This was coordinated, trained. They hadn't just come for his data. They had come to remind him how much they knew, and how closely they were still watching. He returned inside, unsealed a burner phone from his emergency kit, and powered it on. The moment the signal connected, a new voicemail appeared, time-stamped from just before the window had shattered. There was no caller ID, no return number. He pressed play and listened. The voice was male, low and deliberate, with a cold steadiness that suggested no emotion, only certainty. "You're unraveling something you helped build. Stop now." There was no threat, no insult, just fact, clinical, direct, and final. The message ended there. He played it again, this time with Tanya beside him. She said nothing while it played, but when the voice cut off, she reached for the counter and slowly set her coffee mug down. "They're not warning you," she said, her voice a mix of anger and clarity. "They're telling you that you've crossed a line." Elijah nodded, staring at the phone like it held the weight of the entire machine now turning against them. "And they think I'll retreat." She looked at him carefully. "Will you?" "No," he said. "Not after this." He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a fresh legal pad, not to rewrite what had been taken, but to begin drafting something new. The event would go on. The location would stay the same. And this time, every speech, every story, every face in that crowd would be recorded, backed up, and streamed beyond the reach of the people still pulling the strings in the dark. They hadn't silenced him. They had only confirmed how deep the truth ran, and who else it was now meant to reach. The drive out to the hills took longer than Elijah remembered. The road curved in long, quiet stretches, the kind that felt like they weren't meant to lead anywhere except memory. The last time he had made this trip, it had been under entirely different circumstances. Briefings, transfers, and the kind of controlled urgency that didn't invite questions. Now, the silence felt heavier, not because of what he hoped to learn, but because of what he already suspected. He parked at the edge of a gravel drive, the house small and weather-worn, a modest cabin surrounded by pine trees and the distant hum of nothing. On the porch sat a man in a worn flannel shirt, sleeves rolled, eyes shaded by a ball cap that had seen more years than some of the wars they'd survived. Frank Kelton hadn't aged much, at least not on the outside. The sharpness in his expression remained intact, even if the years had smoothed the edges of his frame. He stood before Elijah reached the steps, already reading the questions written across his old colleague's face. "You're late," Frank said, not unkindly. "You didn't say a time," Elijah replied. Frank gave a tight smile. "Exactly." They sat on the porch, in the kind of silence that only two men who had spent years in noise could share without discomfort. It wasn't until Elijah pulled a folder from his bag, a copy of the symbols Naomi had drawn beside the leaked Operation Anchor tag, that the air shifted. "I need to know what this is," Elijah said, sliding the pages across the table between them. "I already know it wasn't fake." Frank didn't touch the pages. He looked at them, then looked back at Elijah, something settling in his posture like a decision he hadn't wanted to make but had finally accepted. "It was real," he said after a moment. "Started as a domestic mapping project under the Department of Defense. Operation Anchor wasn't a single op. It was a series of network programs, predictive containment, community stabilization. They used it to build profiles, flag potential threats before they ever acted. You remember the phrasing, indicators of ideological drift, socio-behavioral deviation markers, neighborhood volatility scores. We ran all of it." "I remember the models," Elijah said. "I built half of them. But we were told it was for post-disaster response. infrastructure strain, social cohesion after storms or terrorist events. We were working with hypotheticals. Frank's voice lowered. We were told what we needed to hear, and we wanted to believe it. Elijah's jaw clenched. So what happened? What always happens, Frank said. The framework worked. Too well. Some contractor ran the models through different inputs, crime stats, protest patterns, voter shifts. They started generating heat maps, showing where the unrest would come from next. Only it wasn't predicting terrorism. It was predicting demographic disruption. And that's when it got buried, rerouted through civilian partnerships, and rebranded under federal resilience initiatives, the kind that report to no one. Elijah leaned forward, the pages still untouched between them. Why didn't I know this? Frank finally looked at him, the weight behind his gaze more personal now. You didn't ask. None of us did. You were one of the best data miners we had. You built tools no one else could. You built the blockchaining for local surveillance adaptation. You designed the Community Signal Index. That index was for population stress points, Elijah said, but the words felt hollow even as he said them. It was supposed to help. It did help, Frank said. Just not the people we thought. Elijah fell back in his chair, the ache behind his eyes settling in. The Iron Crows are using it, he said finally. They've adopted the framework, the way they're moving, the way they're tagging homes, the way they're building these patterns. It's all based on the same lattice model we used. They're not just imitating the system. They are the system. Frank didn't respond. He just stared out over the ridge, his hands folding slowly. I leaked the files, Elijah continued. I exposed what I could. But someone knew. They broke into my house. They wiped my drives. Took Naomi's sketchbook. They left a message. Frank didn't blink. They want you to stop. I know, but I won't. There was a pause before Frank said anything else, and when he did, it came with a name Elijah hadn't expected to hear. Darnell knew. Elijah turned slowly. What? He was part of the civilian review panel when Anchor transitioned into off-grid testing. He was supposed to make sure the application didn't shift toward bias. He was one of the watchdogs. No, Elijah said, shaking his head. Darnell's been fighting these groups for decades. He was one of the only people who told the truth. He did, Frank said, until the model started working, until it became bigger than oversight. He saw what it could become, and he walked away. But he never told you. Not because he didn't believe in you, Elijah, but because he knew what it would mean if you found out your own hands were in the foundation. Elijah sat with that for a long time, the weight of it not sharp, but slow and unrelenting. His work, meant to stabilize and support, had become the very thing now used to target families like his. It had been repurposed, repainted, and turned inward, against the people who were never supposed to be seen as threats. He stood, the air heavy, the ground beneath him feeling strangely unsteady. I need to speak to him, Elijah said. Frank shook his head. He's not going to answer. Not now. Then I'll go to him. Frank nodded, then added quietly, You still planning your event? Yes, Elijah said. And I'm not just telling the story of what they did. He turned toward the car. I'm telling the story of what I did. Because if the system had begun with his silence, then it would have to end with his voice. The church was empty when Elijah arrived. No lights, no choir practice echoing through the halls, just the hollow stillness of a midweek afternoon and the faint scent of old wood and dust. Darnell had always liked to meet here. Neutral ground, he called it. The kind of place people listened because the walls held more than echoes. Elijah walked through the side entrance without knocking, his footsteps quiet against the faded linoleum. He found Darnell in the back office, seated behind a cluttered desk with papers that hadn't been touched in days. There was no surprise in his eyes when Elijah stepped through the door, only a slow exhale, as if he'd been expecting this moment and had dreaded its arrival. "You came," Darnell said quietly. "I found out," Elijah replied, "about Operation Anchor, about your role." Darnell nodded once, neither defensive nor ashamed, just tired. "I figured you would. You were part of the civilian oversight," Elijah continued, closing the door behind him. "You were supposed to keep it from turning into this." "I was never in charge, Elijah," Darnell said. "I was brought in late, after the models had already shown results. My job wasn't to stop it. It was to help it evolve." The silence between them grew heavier, but Elijah didn't move. He needed to hear it. All of it. "You said you fought them," Elijah pressed, voice low, steady. "You said you'd been warning people for years." "And I have," Darnell said. "But not in the way you think. I fought what it became, not how it started." Elijah stepped closer. "You knew about me, about my part in it." Darnell didn't look away. "They told us you were special, methodical, trusted. The kind of analyst who didn't ask questions because he wanted results, not praise. They said you could build the structure we needed without even realizing what it would hold." Elijah's chest tightened, but he kept his voice even. "So I was useful. You were essential," Darnell said. "And I was there to guide you." Elijah stared at him, barely able to breathe through the weight of it. "Guide me?" "They didn't want you drifting," Darnell explained, his voice slow, deliberate, each word like a confession dragged out from some deep well. "You weren't supposed to resist. You were supposed to monitor, observe, build. That was the deal." "You lied to me," Elijah said, not raising his voice, but letting the words land hard. "You stood beside me while they painted symbols on my garage and threatened my daughter. And you still let me think this was just about them." "I regret that more than anything," Darnell said. "But by the time I realized what they'd turned it into, it was already rooted. It had moved beyond oversight. It became the quiet engine beneath every policy, every surveillance contract, every threat assessment program they buried in plain sight." Elijah shook his head, barely able to steady his thoughts. "You watched them weaponize my work against my community. And you said nothing." Darnell's voice cracked, but he didn't cry. "Because I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd never find out. And if you didn't, you could live free of it. I didn't want this weight on you." Elijah stepped back slowly, his hands loose at his sides, as if they no longer belonged to him. "You weren't trying to protect me. You were protecting the system from me." There was nothing left to say. He turned without another word, walked out of the church and into the sharp afternoon light, his mind a storm of revelation and restraint. The betrayal wasn't just the gang or the silence of Brookhaven. It wasn't even the shadowed agents who had tried to erase his evidence. The real betrayal had been structural. Long before the crows, before the noose, before the first drive was wiped, it had been coded into contracts, buried in doctrine, and wrapped in the language of national interest. But if his hands had helped build it, then they would also be the ones to dismantle it. That night, in the same study where the noose had once felt like a call to silence, Elijah uploaded everything. Not just the data Marcus had helped him retrieve or the timelines he'd reconstructed. He included his own records, employment logs, clearance memos, annotated project files from Operation Anchor, and internal communications showing the original intent of the surveillance initiative he had helped design. He didn't redact his name. He didn't hold back. He signed the data dump with a single statement. "If it started with me, it ends with me." The files spread faster than the first leak. National outlets picked it up within hours. The story was no longer just about a hate group operating under the surface of a small town. It was about a former military analyst turned whistleblower exposing a decades-old federal surveillance initiative that had been quietly targeting black families under the guise of community risk prevention. Elijah's name trended within a day. Journalists called, federal officials deflected, civil rights attorneys organized. Within 48 hours, a special counsel was appointed to investigate the origins of Operation Anchor, its reach into civilian agencies and the local departments complicit in hiding its applications. Congressional offices issued statements. Advocacy groups held press conferences. The sheriff, whose earlier retirement had been quietly celebrated by the city council, was now forced to return for questioning under oath. The media uncovered a series of back-channel communications between his office and private contractors tied to Anchor's enforcement structure. He resigned again, but this time under public scrutiny, with an indictment pending for obstruction and evidence tampering. Councilman Harold Greer was also named, along with 2 others linked to funding the Iron Crow community patrols. Their assets were frozen, their roles suspended. The official line was that the investigation would be thorough and just, but Elijah knew better. Justice didn't come from the system. It came from exposure. And now, the world was watching. In the weeks that followed the data release, the ground beneath Brookhaven Ridge shifted in ways most of its residents had never imagined. The town that once prided itself on quiet order now found itself in the spotlight of national reckoning. A federal task force arrived, not just to investigate the Iron Crow gang, but to audit every policy, program, and partnership connected to Operation Anchor. It was no longer an abstract code name buried in a defense file. It was now the center of a very public, very human scandal. Subpoenas were issued. Depositions began. Several arrests were made, this time with records, with headlines, and with cameras present. Harold Greer was indicted for conspiracy, misappropriation of public resources, and obstruction of federal oversight. He was last seen leaving the courthouse through a side door, his face drawn, no longer the untouchable figure who once stood shoulder to shoulder with Sheriff Langley in photo ops. Langley himself, after a failed attempt to delay proceedings, was charged with destruction of public records and willful negligence. The plea deals were swift and silent, but the damage was already done. Their legacies, once carefully cultivated, were gone in days. Operation Anchor, now fully exposed, was formally disbanded under executive order. The Department of Defense issued a rare statement acknowledging its existence, citing a failure of internal safeguards and vowing independent review. Civil liberties groups launched lawsuits across multiple states, demanding restitution for communities flagged, monitored, and quietly targeted. What began as Elijah's personal war for truth had now become a national turning point, proof that harm isn't always loud, and that systems built in silence can do just as much damage as mobs in the street. And yet, through it all, Elijah never once stepped in front of a podium. He let the facts speak. Let the receipts burn through headlines. He remained at home, rebuilding not his image, but his home, piece by piece, frame by frame. Naomi's sketchbook was never recovered, but she had already started another one. She now drew with more confidence, less fear, and a quiet knowledge that her eye for detail had mattered. Elijah sometimes watched her from the hallway, amazed by the way children could survive truth and still create beauty. Tanya's quiet work bore fruit as well. The ledger, once a private message thread shared among concerned parents, had grown into a formal coalition. They renamed it the Bright Line Project and began gathering testimonials from parents all over the county. What started with whispers and side conversations became a documented history of patterns, exclusion, and targeted discipline. They presented their findings before the school board, and this time the board listened. 2 teachers were placed on administrative review. A new diversity oversight committee was created, with Tanya invited to serve as one of its founding members. "I never thought we'd be heard," one mother said to her after a meeting, her voice shaking slightly. "We've been living around this for years, but no one wanted to believe it until someone else bled first." Tanya didn't respond with pride. She simply said, "Now we make sure they keep listening." The gathering Elijah had planned, the one that nearly never happened after the break-in, was held 3 weeks after the last indictment. Dozens came. Some stood in the driveway. Some sat in folding chairs beneath the tree where the noose had once hung. No media. No stage. Just people, black, white, old, young, sharing the same space under the same sky. Elijah stood before them without notes, without headlines behind him, and told the truth. Not just about the gang, not just about Operation Anchor, but about his own part in it. He told them about the framework he had built, the silence he had once called professionalism, and the moment he realized that silence had been the most dangerous design of all. "You can't always see the harm when you're inside the machine," he said. "Sometimes you just call it your job. But when the machine starts hurting people, people who look like your daughter, who sound like your neighbors, you can't pretend you didn't help tighten the bolts." No one interrupted. No one looked away. "And so this," he finished, "this gathering, this truth, this moment, it's not just to name what they did. It's to own what I didn't stop, and to make sure it doesn't happen again." There were tears. There was silence. But no one walked out. In the weeks that followed, Brookhaven Ridge began to change. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in ways that mattered. A new sheriff was appointed, one who had not come up through Langley's chain. Anonymous tips began to flow in about other communities with similar neighborhood watch groups. The Iron Crow name vanished, but not because of fear, because it had been dismantled from the inside out. Elijah never returned to surveillance work. Instead, he taught. Not in a classroom, not in a lecture hall. He began mentoring young people, especially those interested in data, law, or justice, and showed them how systems are built and how they can be broken. He didn't offer simple answers. He offered tools. The evening settled like a calm after a long storm, the kind that doesn't just bring silence, but clarity. Elijah's yard, once the quiet center of a threat no one wanted to name, was now alive with the steady rhythm of conversation, the clink of folding chairs on pavement, the rustle of children weaving between legs and laughter. Porch lights glowed warm. No one looked over their shoulder anymore. At the edge of the garden, where the noose had once been nailed in cowardice, stood something new, a sculpture forged from melted scrap and broken steel. The twisted rope was gone. In its place, iron links fused and bent into a broken chain, jagged at the break, unpolished by design. It didn't need explanation. The transformation was its own story. Naomi stood beneath the tree with a paper in her hand, her voice steady despite the quiet hush that fell around her. "They tied ropes to our doors and called it order. But we are not what they feared. We are what they could never stop." She paused, just once, her eyes lifting to meet her father's. Then she stepped back, into Tanya's waiting arms. The applause was not loud, but it was deep. It meant something. Elijah stepped forward, not to speak from a podium, but from the same spot where he had once stood alone, watching his lawn marked like a battlefield. This time, he stood surrounded. "There was a time I believed the system could fix itself," he said. "But it didn't. And then I found out why." He told them the truth about the program, the silence, the betrayal from within. He said it plainly, without dramatics or pity. "I built tools they used to measure threat. And then they used those tools to call us dangerous." He pointed to the flyer taped to the old maple. "The Civic Sentinel Network. A new initiative. Community-led, transparent, watchful, and accountable. I was trained to monitor," he said. "Now, I monitor back." Tanya stood at his side, arms folded but proud, her eyes moving across the crowd not with fear, but with care. As the sun dipped low behind the rooftops and the broken chain caught the last gold light, the yard, once a target, stood tall. Not as a memory of what was done, but as a line drawn in full view, never to be crossed again. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.